with everyone, and we can have the recording available on our website at some point. So on behalf of Sacramento Jewish Film Festival, the NAACP, Sacramento Faces Race, Central Valley Holocaust Educators Network, and the Jewish Community Relations Council, we'd like to welcome you and thank you for participating in our Social Justice Film Festival. I'd like to thank our partners for helping to organize this film series, and I'd especially like to thank Lynn, Berkeley-Baskin, and Judy Hyman for helping me moderate tonight's panel. So we hope you enjoyed watching the documentary film Rosenwald, the incredible story of Julius Rosenwald. And just in case there's some of you who didn't see the film, just give you a few highlights. The film Rosenwald is the story of an immigrant peddler who never finished high school, but rose to become the president of Sears. Influenced by the writings of the educator Booker T. Washington and the Jewish ideals of tzedakah, which means charity, and tikkun olam, which means preparing the world, Rosenwald joined forces with African-American communities during the Jim Crow South to build over 5,300 schools during the early part of the 20th century. He also awarded fellowship grants to a who's who of African-American intellectuals and artists so they can pursue their scholarship and their art. Tonight, we're thrilled to present a panel discussion with the filmmaker, Aviva Kempner, and UC Davis sociology professor, Bruce Haynes. For the first part of the program, our panel members will answer and discuss some prepared questions that we have for them. For the second part, we'll turn to you, the audience, and answer questions that you can post in the chat room. Please direct your questions to one or both panel members while you're posting messages in the chat room. So I'd like to start with welcoming filmmaker Aviva Kempner to virtual Sacramento. Our Jewish Film Festival has presented several of her films over the years, including two of my favorites, The Life and Times of Hank Greenberg and You Who, Mrs. Goldberg. Well, I see too many Greenbergs for you.
A lot of Bergs in my film.
A lot of Bergs, right. We also presented the film Rosenwald in 2016 at the California History Museum. Kempner lives in Washington, D.C., where she's a proponent of voting rights for the disenfranchised citizens of the District of Columbia. She also helped start the Washington Jewish Film Festival in 1990. We're going to see Aviva again on November 15 when she presents a 20-minute preview of a work in progress entitled Imagining the Indian, the Fight Against Native American Mascotting. KVIE TV Channel 6 will host the film preview, and they'll host the panel discussion immediately following. Aviva is also working on two other films right now. One is called Pissed Off, the struggle of female lawmakers to gain equal access to restrooms in our own US Capitol. She also has a film that she's working on about Ben Hecht, a filmmaker and author who tried to expose the American people to the horrors of the Holocaust. I'd also like to welcome Bruce Haynes to our panel. Bruce has been a professor of sociology at UC Davis since 2001. Before that, he taught at Yale. Bruce is an expert on race, ethnicity, and urban society. His work has focused on topics such as segregation, the link between race and ethnicity, and the Black middle class. He and his wife, Sima Solovich, wrote a book about the history of the family called Down the Up Staircase, 3 Generations of a Harlem Family. I first met Bruce at a book signing at the Mondavi Center a few years ago, and in rereading Bruce's book in preparation for this Zoom chat, I discovered that there's an amazing connection between Bruce's grandfather, George Haynes, and Julius Rosenberg. And you'll be hearing about that connection during this evening's program. Bruce Haynes is also the author of a book called The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America. Publishers Weekly wrote that Haynes provides, quote, detailed information about the origins, history, culture, and differences of discrete categories of Black Jews, end quote. So I'd like to start the conversation with some questions for Aviva. Start off with, what inspired you to make this film about Julius Rosenwald?
Right. Well, I had set out 40 years ago to make films about underknown Jewish heroes. And after You Who Mrs. Goldberg came out, I was up in the vineyard, Martha's Vineyard, that is. And I went to a lecture at the Hebrew Center entitled Blacks and Jews. And I went because first Rabbi David Saperstein was talking, who was a friend, who was the head of the Reform Movement office in Washington. But even more impressive to me was going to hear Julian Bond, who was the former SNCC civil rights leader. I was very excited to hear about him. And I figured that he would be talking about, the civil rights era. But sure enough, Julian started talking about Julius Rosenwald and the involvement with the schools and the fact that his own father and uncle, as you can see in the movie, had gotten Rosenwald Fund grants. And it was like a light bulb went off in my head. And I said, that has to be my next film. My own father had been very involved in the poverty program in Detroit and had always grown up with the whole philosophy of a lot of correlations between Blacks and Jews and relationships, especially in the all-city high school I went to, Cass Tech. So I was thrilled to be able to make the movie and surprised that no one had ever made it before, but even more importantly, that people really didn't know Julius Rosenwald's great story. I just have to make one correction. His father was the peddler. He was a high school dropout and he learned, from his father and his uncle's store, but he wasn't a peddler himself. That was one generation up.
Okay. So why did Rosenwald decide to fund the building of schools for African Americans in the South? Who inspired him?
Well, to begin with, he sought out Booker T. Washington because he had read his slave commentary called Up From Slavery, and it really changed his life, realizing that what slavery had meant and what Booker T. was trying to do at Tuskegee. So he invited him up to Chicago. It's depicted in the film, and they just really hit it off. In a lot of ways, they were very parallel in terms of the kind of ideas they had. And when Rosenwald was 50, he decided that he was going to give very generously. As it is, he really did practice a lot. He was very influenced by his rabbi, but he did decide that he wanted to give a lot of money away when he turned 50. And he asked Booker T, what is there that you think I should do? Now, he already had been solicited to come be on the board of Tuskegee because Booker T was very good about getting Northern support for a school. And Booker T quite logically said, listen, the elementary, the young schools here are awful in the segregated South. Could we build like 5 schools near Tuskegee? And that started it. From 5, it morphed into over 5,000, which is just an amazing, when you think it's almost over 600,000 students, including very famous ones like Maya Angelou and of course, the late John Lewis. But I don't know if you all watch MSNBC, but Eugene Robinson went to a Rosenwald school or ever saw a play that George Wolfe directed and wrote. So it's just, it made an amazing difference for young Blacks in the South from, the teens all the way up until the fund ended. So it's so much because of Booker T's suggestion, But I think what was really interesting is the third, and the third. That JR, as they call them, would give a third, that the states still had to own up to give money, but more importantly, that they would be built by and for the African-American communities. And, you know, I think one of the best things that Booker T, there's not often that he stood up to JR, but when he said to him, you know, I mean, it's logical. Rosenwald, you know, Sears made these kit houses and they thought, okay, we'll just send them south and, you know, that'll be the schools. And Booker T said, no, we're going to build the schools. And, you know, as you see in the film, and it's even more, we have a bonus feature on it on the DVD, they really were green architecture in terms of the way the sunlight came through. And and it was the way the community was involved, as well as the students at the school. And it was Robert Taylor's design. I know later on in the film, you see Barbara Bowman, who talks about the Michigan Garden Apartments, something else that JR conceived of to build for those who were coming up from the South in the Great Migration. And Barbara Bowman talks about how her grandfather had the whole idea, you know, to design the schools, but she also is the mother of Valerie Jarrett. So it's another sort of legacy, a name you might know, who was very close to Barack Obama and was, you know, in his cabinet.
And tell us about the campaign that's going on now to create a National Historical Park.
Well, what happened is Dorothy Cantor, who's someone who lives in this area, got so excited by the film, she decided, and I think rightly so, that there should be a park named in Julius Rosenwald's name. So you can go on the site. I think it's the Julius Rosenwald Park. But what's also interesting to me is how much there's been such a movement, because, you know, once desegregation happened, a lot of these schools fell out in disrepair, and the National Historical Trust has done a great job of restoring, I think, over 100 schools all over the country into museums, into recreation centers, and a lot of people who grew up going to them have gone back south and have been behind it. So I think it's great that not only they're trying to name something after Julius Rosenwald in terms of the park, but the restoration of the schools. And the Michigan Garden Apartments have been completely renovated. It's one of the most beautiful apartment complexes now in Chicago. And it's very exciting because you go into the lobby and there's a poster of the film, but more importantly, there's pictures of all, you know, a lot of the artisans who were supported by the fund. So a whole new generation knows who Julius Rosenwald is, because I think he's a great, great example to inspire philanthropy. A lot of his ideas, the matching grants, as well as spending down, but most of all, his generosity is a great role model for today.
Do any of the Rosenwald schools still exist? And what is being done to preserve them?
Well, like I said, that the National Trust is very involved, and there's, I think, over 100, but, you know, every day I get, you know, Google alerts with anything Rosenwald in it. And a lot of new schools are being restored, but it's for another use. It's for a sense of history in the community, and either community centers, which actually the schools were originally, and or museums. So, although one person talked about buying the house, and some of them have, you know, were so badly off they didn't continue on. But there is a whole movement to continue to preserve them, but more importantly, preserve what their original meaning was. So that's great.
Wonderful.
And I know when John Lewis and both Julian Bond separately did these civil rights tours in the South, they made sure to stop by and show these schools. So I would recommend, if, you know, once we can travel again safely, you know, to look up one of these restored schools. You can, you know, can go on the Historical Trust website.
So when we put Aviva and Bruce together on this panel, we didn't know how many connections existed between Julius Rosenwald and Bruce Haynes. And actually, as I said earlier, not really Bruce, but Bruce's grandfather, George Haynes. So George Haynes and Julius Rosenwald, among other things, they were co-founders of the Urban League. And each George Haynes and Julius Rosenwald each had very close ties to W.E.B. Du Bois.
Right.
So, Bruce, I'd like to ask you a few questions. Tell us more about your grandfather, his education, the Great Migration, and what you know about his relationship to Julius Rosenwald beyond what I've mentioned.
How much time do you have? That's a lot to fit in.
A lot of time.
Well, my grandfather's from Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and he came to New York City at the turn of the century to attend the New York School of Philanthropy, which became the School of Social Work at Columbia. And he started doing studies on Black migrants and on work conditions in New York and in Detroit. And then he went on to get his doctorate at Columbia University, being the first African-American to get a doctorate at Columbia University. And he went on in 1911 with Ruth Standish Baldwin at the helm, and the two of them founded the National Urban League. And what was interesting is that Rosenwald was amongst 5 major financial contributors to the beginning of the National Urban League. And for those who don't know, the National Urban League, probably the best thing to compare it to would actually be Hull House. And people know Hull House. They set up settlement houses. They trained the first Black social workers in the 1920s. My grandfather trained many of those first social workers at Fisk University, where he started the social science department at Fisk. He also went on to work in the federal government. Like Rosenwald, he had an interest in the arts. And so one of the things I found most fascinating was the overlap between Rosenwald, who financed Aaron Douglas and everything from sculptors to fine art painters to dancers. And my grandfather worked for the Harmon Foundation. And through the National Urban League, my grandfather was the head of the Harmon Foundation Awards, who also gave prizes to the same Harlem Renaissance artists. And it was in fact through those signifying, pieces of money that both of those two entities gave to the artists, which kind of signified who were the great artists of the Harlem Renaissance. So I'll stop there. I could probably go on. But I just wanted one anecdote. When you said my grandfather, it actually starts with my father. Growing up in New York, I grew up in Harlem near CCNY. And my father would take long trips on the subway up to the Bronx to go to Sears and Roebuck for any kind of tool or washing machine or dryer, any kind of thing like that. And he would go way out of his way. And I learned at a very young age, in fact, that, I didn't understand exactly what it meant, but I knew this was someone who was favorable to Black people. I think I came away with some idea that he was Black or something, but what a 5-year-old does to information. But it always stuck in my mind that Rosenwald was someone who was a major contributor to Black causes.
And I just want to mention one more thing about in terms of artists. You can see maybe behind me, there's a painting. My mother's an artist. The one story that really touches my heart is the story about Augusta Savage, who was a great teacher in Harlem. Actually, she taught a lot of, I think she was Aaron Douglas' teacher. I'm not sure about Lawrence, but that she got a piece in the World's Fair was amazing in '39, you know, based on the song that we're now hearing at the national football teams, you know, the Black National Anthem, Lift Up Every Voice and Sing, that she did not have the money to bring that piece back home. You know, we talk, and it got destroyed. So we talk a lot about sculptures being brought down now. But I think it was last year, I wrote a piece in the New York Times, and Ford Foundation gave money to the National Trust to do a feasibility study. So hopefully we'll restore that sculpture and hopefully get into different places around the country, because I think it's one of the great regrets of a statue that didn't make it home because an artist couldn't afford it. So it's one of the advocacy things I'm doing.
So Bruce, I'm curious, was your grandfather the inspiration for you to get into the field of sociology?
You know, strangely enough, not. When I was in college, already writing a paper and something in sociology while I was up in the stacks, I said, oh, my grandfather wrote something, and I went and looked for his books and pulled them out. And to my surprise, I was really shocked to learn that he wrote these urban studies. My father talked about him as the founder of the Urban League and as an educator. But in some ways, my father grew up in the shadow of this big intellectual and academic. And I think he sort of chose not to pay too much detail, just like a son would to Dad's career. And so he just had the big highlights. So I was actually very shocked when my wife and I went to write the book, and we learned so much about the connections with Rosenwald and with the Jewish community more generally.
Well, actually, we just discovered Ben Hecht, who my next film is about, was this famous screenwriter, newspaper man, but staged these pageants trying to save European Jewry. And among the signatures of the one they had in New York was Bruce's grandmother. So I just saw her name, you know, on the list. So trying to see if Bruce can find a picture or some archives, or at least maybe I can get some material for him. So I think we have a double connection there.
For sure, for sure. Well, Elizabeth was involved with this emergency committee very early, and she was also involved with a group that sent some 400 rabbis to DC in 19-
Right. It was the Orthodox rabbis who protest.
And so when I learned that, I was pretty surprised. Now, keep in mind, my parents put me in a Jewish prep school when I was in New York. So I grew up with lots of Jewish friends. But then, even as I discovered even further, my grandfather had purchased some property back during the 30s in Harlem, a couple of brownstones that my father still owned in the 1960s. And they were sold to finance my brothers and I in private school. And I had heard about the frat house. One of the buildings was belonging to the frat house. And I always believed it was a Black frat house because CCNY was pretty predominantly Puerto Rican and Black at that point in time. And when I did my research, I came to find out that my parents owned the Jewish frat house at City College. And so how my family came to own that particular building, again, shows some involvement of my grandfather with the Jewish community in ways that I'm still discovering.
Can I mention something in addition, even before there's a question about how pertinent this film is still? As you see, it was dedicated to Black Lives Matter even before this movement. The film was, I think, finished 4 years ago or 5. But also, there's a whole movement in terms of changing names. And one is there's a local high school, Wilson High School. And on the bonus features, we have a whole story of how Wilson had Birth of a Nation shown at the White House, you know, praised it to the hilt. And, you know, of course, that's quite a controversy. And it was Rosenwald and the mayor of Chicago that tried to prevent Birth of the Nation to be shown in Chicago. Those are like the stories that didn't make it to the film. And they were even going to do, Rosenwald was ready to to support another film being made. That never got made, but that was the kind of positions he would always do in terms of making sure things were done. I noticed there's a Linda Levy here who's a Rosenwald relative. Linda, can she hear me? Because she might want to say something. Linda, I don't know if she can hear. If you want to say something.
Yeah. Hi. Hi, everybody. Yes. Hi. Yes. I'm Linda Rosenwald Levy, actually. My grandfather, Lessing, was the oldest of JR, as we called him, JR's 5 children. So yeah, he was my great-grandfather, and what a legacy, huh? Wonderful man, as was my grandfather, very philanthropic in the arts.
The thing that really struck me that I think Aviva captures in the film is how important he was at a particular critical time in African-American history. 1908 is the Springfield riots. That's actually the tip of the iceberg. Black communities were being destroyed for the decade before that and would be destroyed for the decade following. And so the Tulsa riots were only the tip of the iceberg of some of the violence taking place. Segregation was coming into the federal government through Wilson, who brought Jim Crow segregation into Washington, D.C. America was going through a period of literally racial cleansing, and a number of books have been written about it by both historians and sociologists. And so for Rosenwald to suddenly develop personal relationships with some of these Black intellectuals is quite remarkable. And like my grandfather, he clearly had a vision of interracial cooperation. That's what my grandfather called it. But the notion that Blacks and whites should work together for transforming these people who were only a generation and a half removed from slavery into a modern world. And so for him, that's what was important about the Urban League. And I imagine this is what was important about these rural schools, because without them, I don't know if many people know, but lots of Southern states never created schools for African Americans. And in fact, and even in the 50s, some were willing to abandon their public schools when they were forced to integrate. And so what Aviva really brings out is what a significant role these schools play in sort of the Black Belt, the Southern Black Belt in rural Black America, which was basically abandoned to its own devices by both federal and state governments.
What I'm hoping is someone one day will do a movie on the Jeans teachers, because I think these young Black women were fascinating. It was a fun from a Quaker woman, and they were like dispersed. It was like an army of teachers going to different rural areas. I think it would make a great documentary. But I'd also love to see a feature film, especially just getting what it meant to put together a school and get it done.
Well, the segregation that faced Black women was even more severe than the segregation that faced Black men as we entered the 20th century. And so where we see a number of Black men getting PhDs and going on to teach at Fisk or at Tuskegee or what have you, women could not get PhDs. And so the women ended up teaching at prestigious high schools, like for instance, the M Street School, which is one of the famous ones there in DC. And so I think that's a great story that that still needs to be told.
So I have just one more question. You've done a great job answering many of the questions that I didn't even have to pose to you. But just one more question before I open it up to the chat room. I'd like each of you to answer this question. Who do you think are the Rosenwalds of today? Either one can start.
Well,
Bill Gates.
Dave.
When we first started talking the other day, when I met Aviva, we started talking about this, and I first thought, I couldn't think of anybody. And then she started naming a number of people, Gates and William Buffett. And I think Buffett was my standout favorite of the people that she mentioned. And that has to do with the significant portion of his wealth that he's given away. He's given away a tremendous amount of his wealth. And many of the philanthropic folks at the turn of the century, including Carnegie, gave away significant portions of their wealth as well.
And I think Bezos's ex-wife, I don't know if she knows about Rosenwald. If I can find an address, I want to send her the film. And even the choices she's just made, including Howard University here, which is probably how I'll be able to, get her a DVD. But I think it's really important. I know one of the best things about the film are people coming out and saying, boy, now I'm inspired to give. And there's nothing that could make me feel happier. Because in fact, I have a 501c3. The way I make my movies is by people giving tax deductible contributions. So these films are made under that auspices, but there's just so much that can be done still.
Great.
I would just like to speak to this a minute also. I think it's a great question about who are the modern Rosenwalds. I think there are many amazing philanthropists, and you've just mentioned a few. But as far as someone who is putting himself and his resources behind a cause that is really transformative for the nation, I don't know who that is. I don't know that person maybe is lurking, maybe is too young still, but I haven't seen evidence of that. And maybe the world has gotten so much more complicated. I mean, we're sitting right now in one of the most complicated times probably ever. So life is not as clear cut. It was quite literally black and white in both senses of the term back then. And now I can't even imagine where you would start to do something. I really can't. I have a pretty good imagination because we never had a TV when I was a kid, but even I can't imagine.
Thanks. So I'd like to turn the program over to Lynn, who is going to be looking at the chat room and seeing the questions. And please continue to use the chat room and post comments and questions in there, please. So Lynn, take it away.
Thank you so much, Teven, and Aviva and Bruce. Thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to be in this space with you today. Thank you so much. So let's get started. I think Dave Harzoff had a question early on, and here it is. Why did Julius want the fund to end after his death?
I think he had a vision of what he wanted to do with the money in his lifetime. I'm pretty sure, I mean, Linda can check with me about that. He did leave money for his kids because they all went on to do great philanthropy too, but he just had this vision. It's called spending down, that kind of—
Give while you live. It's what he said. He used to say, give while you live. Yeah.
And that was his philosophy. You know, it's funny because I started thinking about the other, Ford Foundation actually, and the Spielberg Foundation and the Kellogg Foundation gave money for these 4.5 hours of bonus features and the study guide that accompanied the DVD. So I'm glad all of them did not, well, at least Ford did not end, after his death. So it's just different philanthropists have different ideas, but I think Linda I was just about to say it was give while you live.
But it was also very, very forward thinking, because I think Bill Gates is doing this too. The idea that each generation should take care of its own and then the next generation. Although yet again, such complicated times that might not even be possible.
Economically, I agree with you. I also think it's forward-looking economically, because what happens with funds is they become, they have to self-replicate themselves, and so that means they don't necessarily spend all their money in the
Right, and administrative costs and all that.
Exactly.
Yeah, you're right.
It becomes the monster, so to speak.
Yeah.
Prevented from creating this kind of institutional monster, as opposed to spending the money on the places that he thought it should go.
Right.
Thank you. We actually have quite a few questions. So you ready? Here we go. Elizabeth and Gordon had a question about how did he treat his workers? He seemed so progressive and he was so invested philanthropically. But on the business side, there's a business side and a philanthropic side. How did he treat his management and his workers?
Really well. He took care of them when times were bad. Well, Aviva can speak to this better, but I mean, he was really very generous.
I think there was a time, when economics were very bad, that he didn't let them suffer. Now, he didn't let them unionize, but he, as Linda said, he was very good to his workers. And he also, Sears hired African Americans.
And that was the main reason that my father was so committed to Sears.
Sears.
As was he committed to the New York Mets for the same reason.
The Mets? Okay.
That's funny. So apparently Sandy, is it Maliga? Apparently Sandy Maliga, who's on this video chat, went to school with Nina and Elizabeth Rosenwald.
Okay.
And so apparently she's asking, how did Nina come upon her very right-wing positions, considering Rosenwald's position?
Linda, you want to answer that?
I couldn't begin to. I really seriously have no idea.
Yeah, it's hard to understand.
It's very hard to understand, and it's very, very, very extreme. Really extreme.
It is.
I couldn't answer that.
Okay.
By the way, if you ever go to the National Gallery, Linda's grandfather had one of the great collections of prints, and he donated it to the National Gallery. So when you're walking,
actually, the books are in the Library of Congress, right. This is JR's oldest child, my grandfather Lessing, and he was with Sears for a while, and then he always said that he was so lucky because his avocation and his vocation were the same thing. He said that to me more than once. He was a bibliophile, and he collected rare books and art. I mean, books that were illuminated manuscripts, William Blake, Toulouse-Lautrec. You can't even imagine this, a wonderful collection. And also prints and early woodcuts and all kinds of things. And in the 40s, well, let me just say, they lived in Philadelphia. My grandparents moved from Chicago to Philadelphia in 1920. The Rosenwald family was originally from Chicago. And when he got to Philadelphia with my grandmother and some kids, including my dad, they bought some land, took down a house and rebuilt it. And it included a gallery, a beautiful, wonderful gallery, not particularly large, but just brilliantly gorgeous. And so in the 40s, he gave his collection to the nation, to, as we've just said, the library and the National Gallery. And in his lifetime, the collection went back and forth between Washington and Jenkintown, Pennsylvania, which is a suburb of Philadelphia, just north of the city. And when he died, literally the day he died, Washington was there packing up, and they even took parts of his it was called the Reading Room, part of his gallery. They moved. They literally took it apart and moved it. And there is a Rosenwald room in the Library of Congress with all the things that I remember from when I was a child, with an altar cloth over a fireplace, that's there, and the head of Medusa done by a Swedish sculptor, Carl Millis, that's there. And the beautiful, beautiful book table made of some special African wood. So at one end, when you look down it was light wood, and from the other end, you look down and it was dark wood. All of that was moved to Washington. So if you're ever there, if you can ever travel again, take a look. It's pretty wonderful.
And at MoMA and at the Phillips Gallery, Jacob Lawrence's famous migration series is split in half. Half is at Phillips and half is at MoMA. And Lessing's sister bought the collection for MoMA.
Actually, his daughter.
His daughter, sorry.
His daughter, yes, Adele. She was one of the founders of MoMA.
Well, thank you.
I can't remember if I saw this in your film, Aviva, or if I read it somewhere or saw it in some other film. But Linda, tell me if I'm not mistaken that everyone called him JR, family, friends, co-workers.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the indications of kind of the, you know,
Egalitarianism.
Yeah, you could come and talk to him.
Yes. I got to know him, not while he was living because I was born after he died, but when my mother died at 101 in Philadelphia, in her attic, this was a house that had been in the family, her family for many generations. And in the attic was a lot of JR's things. In fact, we shipped it out to his papers at the University of Chicago. It all went there, but I got to read some of his letters home to his kids. And it was, I'm so sorry I didn't know him. He was adorable. He was just such a sweet guy, and just a very obviously warm, loving father and husband. It was a real treat to read those letters.
Wow, thank you for sharing all of this. This is just wonderful information. So moving on to the specifics, Aviva, I think that you'll have to speak to these. So Elizabeth and Gordon asked a question, and Andrea Rosen actually asked a related question. So Elizabeth and Gordon point out that the density of where the schools are is different state to state. Mississippi and Alabama appear to have a higher density of schools. And
North Carolina also.
Okay, and then, but related to that, Andrea asks specifically if there of any of the communities that were unable to come up with their third of the cost of the building for the schools. And so is that related in any way, the density of the schools and whether people were able to come up with the money?
Well, the only thing I know is I'm still trying to figure out why North Carolina had the most. And I keep on thinking it also had to do with more progressive school board. And right now there's a film being made about the North Carolina schools. So the answer may have to come more there. But I guess you're right. It might have been that the communities couldn't come up with it.
Excellent. Oh, please continue.
As much as I know. Bruce, do you have an answer for that?
You know, I wouldn't guess the communities couldn't come up with it, but there is a concentration. I actually marked down Alabama, Louisiana, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, Kentucky, and they were all kind of concentrated in those states. The only thing I saw that connected them was that they were sort of the Bible Belt. They were, you know, the half, and the other thing is half of them were slave states and half of them weren't. So I didn't see a pattern there either. So I'm not sure.
Thank you. And Andrea also asked a follow-up question about how can people find out where the Rosenwald schools that are being repurposed? Where can people find that information?
It's very easy. Just go to the National Trust for Historical Preservation and then there's a sub thing on the Rosenwald schools, and it's great. You can find out where you can go visit them. There's actually some just outside of the Washington area in Maryland. I am so naive that I always thought, because growing up in Detroit, we used to visit Baltimore. We had mishpacha there. I never realized that Maryland was a Jim Crow state. And in fact, there's several schools, within driving distance from here. And they did one beautiful restoration there. So I would, you could, like I said, whenever you come to the South and take a trip, you can go to a Rosenwald school, for sure.
Thank you. I wanted to point out the chat for folks. Judy made a comment in the chat. There are some other comments in the chat if you'd like to read them. Also, I'm going to go to, I don't know how much more time we have, but I do have another question from Sandy Maliga, who would like to know more about the life over the past 5 years of the film, to talk about that.
Well, it had a wonderful commercial release. I make movies. In some ways, I'm my worst enemy. I mean, I love being able to show it in a theater and get a reaction. And it was all around the country, got rated very high on Rotten Tomatoes. Audiences loved it, a lot of festivals. And thanks to, as I said, these 3 foundations, and it's actually Kellogg that's paying for tonight's screening, that there's now this DVD, this study guide. So it's having a lot of non-theatrical screenings as well as in schools. And just now in the last month, I still have to pay off some rights, but I'm trying to either get a TV or going right to streaming because, I want everyone to be able to see it. And now it's so much more relevant, or, so much more of interest in Black history, American history. So I've just been thrilled, and especially, very, very integrated audiences, which makes me feel really good. And as much as possible, trying to get, like tonight's, some screenings together. And, the other thing is that, like most of my films, 3 generations coming to the movie. So that's great.
That is beautiful, really beautiful. I'm just wondering, so here Mike actually asks, how do you think Rosenwald, so you have to predict a little bit here, how do you think Rosenwald would spend his fortune today? So some speculation on your part. Bruce, you could chime in too.
And Linda.
Linda too, please.
What a question. That's a really great question.
I'd say maybe he'd take advantage of the charter school framework and
I think he'd throw some money at the political.
Yeah.
Hold on one second, Linda.
Yeah. Well, especially as we approach this election, that might be his choice, right? But yeah, in terms of schools, I would imagine we would see state-of-the-art charter schools that would be on the cutting edge of things. That's what I'd imagine.
Aviva, would you like to?
I just think, everything. I mean, right, health, climate. I mean, just, whatever it seemed so clear when he saw there was an issue, he gave money to it. And, I concentrated in the film very much to his giving in the African-American community, but he also was very generous in his own Jewish community, especially in Chicago. He even gave money to people in Eastern Europe after the pogrom. And to his own synagogue. And then after he passed away, it was his own relatives that, including that gave money to save their relatives from Germany, over 300. So I think he would probably be very involved in, the whole immigrant thing. I mean, I think if there was a problem, he would be there and trying to do something.
Yeah, I agree with Aviva. And I actually wonder, Bruce, if it would be education this time around. Maybe it would, but there's so many things that would be calling his name, I think. Yes,
Well, Black Lives Matter would certainly be the
absolutely. And immigration. I mean,
Sure.
Yeah, the idea that people are fleeing and get kicked back is I think is so powerfully awful that yeah, I don't know. You
Thank
could
you.
probably throw darts at many problems and hit them all. Yeah.
So we're also hearing some comment from Dave Harzoff again, kind of looking at at JR's history and saying, you know, do you have any evidence of where his enlightened and progressive values come from? Recognizing he was undereducated and he doesn't come from a remarkably educated background, formally that is.
Well, Aviva, maybe Emil Hirsch, and yeah.
I think Hirsch had a lot to do with that. You know, it's really interesting to me that people who weren't even Jewish, at that time they were going on Sundays because it was a Reform synagogue and people still kept their stores open on Saturday. I mean, he was a great orator. Again, I have a whole bonus feature on him in the DVD, which is available on the website for purchase. I mean, he would call out someone who was hurting his workers in a sermon. But more importantly, he was very inspirational. I mean, Hirsch was one of the founders of the NAACP, which Rosenwald gave money to, as well as the NAACP Educational Fund. So, and I think he took literally, as I think everyone should, not just who are Jewish, that, you know, repairing the world is one of our responsibilities, especially if we have the means to do it. And tzedakah, the charity, is important. So, you know, it's funny because when he first went down to Tuskegee, the rabbi was in the train with him. So he didn't go far without him. You know, he was a great influence on him.
Also keep in mind, although the National Urban League and the NAACP get federal money today for whatever programs they're running, when those organizations were founded, they were independent and survived only on private money, you know, individuals giving donations. So they had no federal money, no federal grants, no public support. And so they were also keeping into Rosenwald's idea of, you know, economic independence.
And, you know, it's also, you know, they would go every summer to Germany and he saw, you know, how his kids love the science museum. So he came back to Chicago and said, oh, I'm going to build a science museum. You know, just when he,
that was his younger son, my grandfather's youngest brother, Bill Rosenwald, who actually became an enormously powerful supporter of Israel. But he was the one that went with JR to the Deutsches Museum in Germany, loved it. And they came back and it became the Museum of Science and Industry, which parenthetically was to have been called the Rosenwald Museum. And JR wouldn't have that. He really was a very quiet man, which is why Aviva was able to find a little known man in him. Because
and when he has that one talk that says so many, you know, some people are in it for, you know, they're just lucky that they get rich. I got a lot of laughs in the last 3 years over that particular line.
Yeah.
Well, you know, what actually was one of the things I really love about some of the things he said, that, you know, getting rich was really about being lucky. And he seemed to recognize that, you know, hard work didn't make you rich. You know, luck and you know, fortune and having a good fate, you know, or it was the thing for him.
Couldn't we use a little more of that today? Because I think people don't really realize the luck, if you want to call it that. I mean, at this point, it's sort of revolting, but, you know, to be born with white skin, that is luck in our society today. And the people who say, well, I've worked hard and I've worked, you know, how about, were you born in a house with books in it? You know, did you come from a family that could send you to school and to college and maybe beyond? You know, where did you come from? A lot of that really impacts your whole life and the life of your descendants and informs your life in a way that has led to the other part of it, of course, which is systemic racism, is the other half of that very same informed life. What's it been informed with?
And
So,
on the
wow,
same, by the
big
same,
factor.
along the same lines, I think he would be upset with the growing wealth gap that we've observed over the past 20
Yes,
years as
I
well.
for
agree.
sure.
On the other hand, he had a great business sense. I mean, one of my favorite stories is having the catalog, making it smaller than the other. And it really was Amazon before Amazon, you know, getting the young boys on skates so they could move faster to package. I mean, there was some real good business sense in terms of, you know, the supply and demand of Sears back then.
Well, I love that if you're in Ohio, you could get a house delivered to you.
Right.
So, excuse me for interrupting, Teven. I think we're out of time. We do have a couple of questions that we haven't gotten to yet. What would you like to do?
Just, we're here.
You're here?
Yeah, just keep going, I think.
Great, great. Okay, just making sure.
Okay. I mean, there aren't that many more questions.
Nope, 2 more questions, so thank you. Specifically, Sharon Alexander comments that the film is very upbeat. Did Rosenwald experience any trials or tribulations that might have been touched upon in this film? Maybe weren't in the film.
No, I mean, there's one thing again that makes to the bonus features. I mean, it's not what he supported, and that, you know, people, you shouldn't underestimate there was some bravery on his part, because being Jewish in the South also faced anti-Semitism. And then, of course, we have the story of Leo Frank being lynched. And he actually supported the defense fund with part of the Salzburg family, the New York Times. And that's in the bonus feature about him. So I think that, you know, I'm sure I think consciously or unconsciously, one of the reasons he supported education so much is I think it's the great irony that he did. And he also supported a lot of colleges as well as University of Chicago, historical Black colleges. The man stopped going to school at 16. It's like Gertrude Berg and the Molly Goldberg character, her own mother, you know, was institutionalized because she had emotional issues. It's almost as if you do what you didn't get yourself. And I think he should be admired for that.
Thank you so much. And how about, Aviva, how did you find so much video content for this film?
Well, I borrowed a lot. I believe in feature films. You know, when we had this whole thing about his father being a peddler. So I thought, oh my God, Dr. Quinn, Medicine Women. I remember watching it, and I remember the Christmas show, you know, where he comes and the Jewish peddler comes, and, you know, Hasia Donner, who went on to even write a book on JR, talks about, you know, the peddler would come and sell to the settlers and to the African Americans and to the Indians. It's just the way we cut it. It was just perfect. And then when we wanted a scene of what the marriage would be like, sure enough, there was a scene from, you know, this rabbi coming to America. As a matter of fact, someone came out of the film and said, how did you get the footage of you know, JR's parents? I mean, you know, they even believed it. So I you know, and then of course I got to have Clint Eastwood speaking Yiddish. That, I think, unfortunately, my father never saw any of my films, but he was a great Yiddishist. But I thought of him when I saw it. But seriously, I think that oftentimes feature films, when they're done right, can really set the period. And, you know, even like the footage of the sleeping car porters, who to me, that was another great revelation of real heroes. I mean, these men risked their lives bringing the Chicago defenders back down south to spread out to people to say, hey, come north. I mean, there's just so much I learned from making the film.
Thank you. Yeah, that was so
Lynn,
enlightening. Yes.
I want to say 2 things I put in the chat room. I just want to draw people's attention to. The last thing I put in was a link to the study guide that Aviva has been talking about. It's over 100 pages. And I was telling her, it is the most amazing and complete study guide I've ever seen for any film. It is just incredible. So I encourage people to check out the link. The other thing is we have more films. There's another 5 films as part of our Social Justice Film Festival. And if you go to the link I put in the chat, it's jewishsac.org/social justice. And I encourage people to check out some of the other films that we're showing. Bruce is going to be joining us in a couple of weeks to see the film called Shared Legacies, which is...
I've got to see that. I got to come back for that.
So, so please check out that. We're going to have that available online between October 8th and 13th. And the chat is October the 13th.
Great.
All
And just say that the study guide makes more sense with the 4.5 hours more of the films because they're tied to that. Great little vignettes. Let me just leave you with a Rabbi Hirsch story. So one of the things, he was getting very upset that so many of the young girls in his congregation were having nose jobs. So he would get up, he says, you can change your noses, but you can't change your Moses. I always love that line. Talking about people I would have loved to have met is, I mean, besides, of course, JR. And, you know, I always think that I have to get World War II in every film, being a child of a Holocaust survivor and, you know, all my films. And I thought, okay, there's nothing with JR. And sure enough, the Rosenwald Fund funded the Tuskegee Airfield. They loaned the money that made a difference to build that field. So I was really glad that, you know, that was the end of the film.
Yeah, that was very interesting.
You know, I want to throw in this last little thing too. Maybe it's not totally related, but maybe to me it's related. I wouldn't have been a sociologist hadn't it been for a Jewish intellectual named Jay Shulman, who used to teach at CCNY himself and founded the National Jury Project. And so there are other folks out there doing the same kinds of things that Rosenwald had done, maybe on a smaller scale.
But maybe on the same scale vis-a-vis resources. So yeah, could be same thing.
So everyone wear a mask. I hope you get some clear air. Get everyone to vote.
Yes.
Yes, get everyone to vote is right.
Lynn and Teven.
Don't ever assume ever that somebody's, of course they'll vote. Just work on it. There's also a really, I probably shouldn't do this, but I'm going to plug Vote Forward. This is something that I did in 2018. I'm doing again, and it's letters. They found that it's not supporting a candidate, but full disclosure, the list is irregular voters who are Democratic leaning. Anyway, you write letters, and I helped flip a district actually in Staten Island in 2018. I'm sure it was the 100 letters that I wrote. No, I'm kidding, but I did write 100 letters.
Linda, you'll be happy to know that the Sacramento National Council of Jewish Women has a huge Vote Forward presence.
Oh, great,
They've
great.
already written, they've been madly writing, already written over 1,000.
Brilliant.
And also our temple is participating with the Religious Action Center, and we're writing postcards for the organization. Many of us are, for Reclaim Our Vote to disenrolled voters in Texas.
Great. No, it's great.
And you notice the film is also dedicated to voting rights for the District of Columbia and statehood. So hopefully that's the last time I'll put that on the film, on one of my films.
I hope we get that.
If we have a majority in the Senate, we will.
Well, I'm doing a lot of texting. It's not as old fashioned as writing letters, but it's
well, no, but that's good because you can get to the younger people. That's the most important thing.
right.
Just so you're doing something, and then you at least feel like you're doing something. That's as important as doing
Yes, right.
it, is not feeling powerless.
I don't want to feel guilty.
That
If anything
too.
goes wrong.
Don't even think it. Don't even think it. Oh my God. I know. Very nervous making.
Yes.
Kevin,
Aviva,
I've turned it
Bruce,
back over
was
to
nice
you.
to meet you. Very nice
Well,
to
I
meet you.
hope
Yeah.
you come back and join us for Imagining the Indian, which is the great story of the fight against Native American mascotting.
yeah, that looks really great.
That'll be November 15.
Right.
So again, thank all of you for being part of this chat, and thank all of you for watching the film. And as I said, I encourage you to see more of the films that we'll be presenting.
And thanks to the Kellogg Foundation for supporting tonight's screening.
Wonderful. And thank you again to Aviva and Bruce for being
Thanks for
part of
inviting
the panel. And thanks to Judy and Lynn for helping with the moderation. So thank you all. Really appreciate it.
Thank
Good night.
you. Good night, guys.
Stay